The dressing room at Detroit's Cobo Arena was quiet, except for the sound of cold cream being wiped across silver makeup. Ace Frehley sat alone in front of the mirror, his hand moving mechanically across his face, removing the cosmic design he'd worn for 3 hours on stage, black and silver smeared together, revealing pale skin underneath. And then it happened. The thing that had been building for months, maybe years. Ace looked at his reflection, at the half-removed makeup, at the stranger staring back at him, and he started to cry. Not the quiet tears of exhaustion, deep, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere he didn't recognize anymore. Because the face in the mirror wasn't Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx. It wasn't even Ace Frehley, the guitarist. It was something caught between two identities, belonging fully to neither. A ghost of the person he used to be and a prisoner of the character he'd become. It was November 1978, and Kiss was at the absolute peak of their power. That September, all 4 members had released solo albums simultaneously, an unprecedented marketing stunt that Casablanca Records promoted as the event of the decade. 4 albums, 4 characters, 1 date. The competition between the band members was brutal, even if nobody admitted it publicly. Gene's album sold the most initially because of his public profile. Paul's album had the hit single. Peter's album surprised everyone with strong sales, and Ace's album, featuring his song New York Groove, became the sleeper hit that would eventually outsell them all. But even that success felt strange to Ace, because the press coverage focused on Space Ace's solo album, not Ace Frehley's music. The character was overshadowing everything, even his own artistic achievement. Arena tours were selling out in minutes across the country. Action figures were flying off shelves faster than toy companies could manufacture them. The band wasn't just successful, they were a cultural phenomenon, a marketing empire disguised as a rock band. And at the center of it all were 4 faces that America knew better than most presidents: Gene's demon, Paul's star, Peter's cat, and Ace's silver space invader, Space Ace, the cosmic guitarist from another planet who played smoking guitars and shot rockets from his instruments. Children across the country wore his mask for Halloween. His action figure was the bestseller in toy stores from New York to California. His face was on lunchboxes that kids carried to school, comic books published by Marvel, pinball machines in every arcade. The Kiss Army, the official fan club with over 100,000 registered members by 1978, voted Space Ace as their favorite member in poll after poll. Not Ace Frehley, the musician, Space Ace, the character. They wrote him fan letters addressed to his home planet. They asked if he really came from outer space. They wanted to know what it was like being an alien. And nobody, not the fans, not the press, not even the band's management, seemed particularly interested in Paul Frehley, the actual human being who was slowly disappearing behind the silver mask. The kid from the Bronx had never planned to become a character. When he'd joined Kiss in 1973, it was supposed to be about music. Just 4 guys who could play their instruments, write songs, and maybe make enough money to quit their day jobs. Ace had been playing guitar since he was 13, teaching himself on a second-hand Gibson, learning by ear, developing a style that was part blues, part rock and roll, all feeling. He wasn't the most technical player, but he had something more important: soul. When Ace played, you felt it. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had recognized that immediately. They needed a lead guitarist who could make their songs soar, someone who understood melody and emotion, not just speed and flash. Ace was perfect. At the audition, he'd plugged in and played, and within 3 songs, he was in the band. The makeup came later. It was 1975, and Kiss was struggling to break through. They had the songs, they had the energy, but they were getting lost in a sea of other hard rock bands. Every city had a dozen groups that sounded similar, looked similar. Paul Stanley had the idea first. What if they created characters? What if they became larger than life, turned themselves into comic book heroes? Gene loved it immediately. He'd always wanted to be theatrical, to create spectacle. Peter was hesitant, but came around. and Ace thought it was insane, but also kind of cool in a weird way. They each designed their own face. Gene became the demon, breathing fire and spitting blood. Paul became the star child, the romantic frontman. Peter became the cat, mysterious and feline. And Ace, who'd always loved science fiction and had a fascination with space, became the spaceman. Silver and black cosmic designs, stars around his eyes, lightning bolts across his cheeks. Space Ace was born. At first it was fun. The makeup gave them mystique, made them memorable. Kids went crazy for it. The album, Alive, exploded in 1975, turning Kiss from a struggling club band into arena headliners almost overnight. And the characters worked because they enhanced what was already there. Gene was always theatrical. Now he had an outlet. Paul was always a showman. Now he had a persona. Peter was always a bit detached. The cat fit him. And Ace, who'd always been the quiet one, the guy who let his guitar do the talking, suddenly had this cosmic rebel identity that felt liberating. He could hide behind the silver face and just play. No pressure to be charismatic or chatty. Space Ace didn't need to explain himself. He just needed to play smoking guitar solos and look cool doing it. But something happened between 1975 and 1978. The characters stopped being enhancements and started becoming prisons. Kiss wasn't just a band anymore. It was a brand. A corporation. Gene and Paul, who were natural businessmen, embraced it completely. They saw the merchandising potential and ran with it. Action figures, masks, comic books, board games, pinball machines, even a made-for-TV movie. Every product needed the four faces, the four characters. And the more products that hit the market, the more the characters became the reality and the people underneath became irrelevant. Children who bought the toys didn't know or care that there were real people under the makeup. They didn't want to meet Paul Frehley or George Peter John Criscuola. They wanted Space Ace and the Catman. The humans were just the engines that powered the characters. Ace felt it happening gradually, like sand slipping through fingers. The moment he realized something was deeply wrong was at a meet and greet in Chicago, summer of 1978. A young fan, maybe 10 years old, came up to him backstage. Ace wasn't in makeup, just regular clothes, regular face. The kid looked right at him, then looked around confused, asking his mother where Space Ace was. The mother had to explain that this was him, that Space Ace wasn't real. It was just makeup. The kid looked devastated, and then he looked at Ace with something worse than disappointment, resentment, like Ace had ruined the magic by being human. The kid didn't want an autograph anymore. He walked away. Ace stood there feeling like he'd committed some crime by having a regular face. That night, he couldn't sleep. The image of that kid's disappointed face kept replaying, and he realized with sickening clarity that to the world, Space Ace was real, and Paul Frehley was the imposter. The 1978 tour schedule was brutal, over 100 shows across America, Europe, Japan. Every night, the same ritual. Arrive at the venue hours before showtime. Get into costume, platform boots, leather and studs. Sit in front of the makeup mirror for 45 minutes while professional makeup artists applied the silver and black design. It had to be perfect, exactly the same every night. The fans expected consistency. Space Ace had to look like Space Ace, not some approximation. And every night, Ace would watch in the mirror as Paul Frehley disappeared and Space Ace emerged. At first, he'd make jokes during the application, talk to the crew, stay present. But as the tour went on, he started going quiet, sitting still, staring at his reflection, watching the transformation like a man watching himself be erased. The shows themselves were incredible. Kiss at their peak was an unstoppable force. Pyrotechnics, lights, smoke, platforms rising from the stage, Gene breathing fire, Paul flying on wires, Peter's drum kit levitating, and Ace playing his smoking guitar, rockets shooting from the neck during his solos. The crowds went insane every night. 18,000 people screaming for Space Ace, reaching for him like he was some kind of deity. And on stage, wearing the makeup, Ace could be that deity. He could be cosmic, untouchable, perfect. But the moment he walked off stage, the moment the lights went down, reality crashed back. He wasn't a space hero. He was a tired guy from the Bronx in ridiculous platform boots with his face covered in grease paint, performing the same show he'd performed the night before and would perform again tomorrow. The worst part was after the shows. The crew knew the routine. Get the band off stage, into the dressing rooms, start the removal process. 45 minutes to put the makeup on, another 30 to get it off. Cold cream, towels, careful wiping. And every night, Ace would sit in front of that mirror again, watching Space Ace disappear and Paul Frehley reluctantly return. Except Paul Frehley felt less real than Space Ace now. The normal face looked wrong, unfamiliar. Sometimes Ace would stare at his bare reflection and genuinely not recognize the person looking back. Gene and Paul noticed, but misunderstood. They thought Ace was just tired from the tour, maybe drinking too much. Gene pulled him aside in St. Louis, told him to ease up on the partying, stay focused. Paul gave him pep talks about how great everything was going, how they were living the dream. Neither of them understood what Ace was trying to articulate in the few moments he attempted to explain it. How could he tell them that he was losing himself? That every night he put on the makeup, a little more of the real him stayed behind, trapped somewhere he couldn't reach? They'd think he was being dramatic, ungrateful. Here they were, the biggest band in the world, making millions, and Ace was complaining about wearing makeup. It sounded ridiculous even to him. But it wasn't about the makeup. It was about identity. It was about slowly realizing that the world didn't want Paul Frehley. It wanted Space Ace, and Paul Frehley was becoming obsolete. The crew saw it more clearly. The makeup artists, the road managers, the guitar techs who spent hours with him every day watched Ace's mood deteriorate as the tour progressed. Mike, his guitar tech since 1976, later recalled that by November 1978, Ace had stopped making eye contact with people when he wasn't in makeup. He'd look down, look away, never directly at someone. Like being Paul Frehley was somehow inferior to being Space Ace. The breaking point came in Detroit. November 16, 1978, Cobo Arena. The show had gone perfectly. Sold-out crowd, incredible energy, no technical problems. Ace's guitar solo during his signature song had been flawless, one of the best he'd played all tour. The audience had erupted. Space Ace had conquered another city. Backstage, after the encore, the band was high on adrenaline. Gene and Paul were already talking about the next city, the next show. Peter was quiet as usual, heading to his dressing room. And Ace sat down in front of his makeup mirror, picked up the cold cream, and started the removal process. The makeup artist offered to help, but Ace waved her away. He wanted to be alone. He worked in silence, wiping away the silver, the black, revealing skin underneath. Right side first, the star patterns around his eye disappearing into smears of gray. Then the left side, the lightning bolt vanishing. His forehead, his cheeks, his chin, each stroke revealing more of Paul Frehley, less of Space Ace. And halfway through, with his face a bizarre mix of cosmic design and normal skin, Ace stopped. His hand froze, holding a towel covered in silver makeup. He stared at his reflection, at the half-finished removal, at the person caught between two identities. And something inside him shattered. The tears came suddenly without warning, deep, painful sobs that seemed to come from his chest, his stomach, somewhere fundamental. He couldn't stop, couldn't catch his breath. He pressed his hands against the makeup table, leaning forward, watching himself cry in the mirror through silver-smeared eyes. A crew member heard the sounds, thought something was medically wrong, and rushed to get Gene. Gene arrived, saw Ace crying at the makeup table, and his first instinct was anger. What was wrong? What happened? Was Ace drunk? High? Ace couldn't explain through the sobs, couldn't form words. Gene stood there, confused and frustrated, not knowing what to do. Paul arrived next, then the tour manager. 3 people standing behind Ace, watching him cry at his reflection. Nobody understanding what they were witnessing. Ace finally managed to speak, his voice broken and raw, saying something that made everyone in that room go quiet. He said, "I don't know who I am anymore. I look at this face and I don't recognize it. I don't know if I'm Ace or if I'm the character or if there's any difference left." Paul Stanley tried to comfort him, putting a hand on his shoulder, telling him it was just exhaustion. They'd take a break after this leg of the tour. Ace would feel better after some rest. But Ace shook his head, still crying, still staring at his half-removed makeup. "It's not exhaustion," he said. "It's that I've disappeared. When I put on the makeup, I become Space Ace, and I feel real. When I take it off, I'm supposed to become myself again, but there's nothing there. Just this empty face that used to belong to someone I barely remember." Gene, who'd always been the pragmatic one, the businessman, suddenly looked uncomfortable. He didn't know how to handle emotional breakdowns. That wasn't part of the plan. The plan was simple: put on makeup, play show, take off makeup, count money, repeat. Nobody was supposed to have existential crises about cartoon characters. The moment passed. It had to pass. They had another show in 2 days in Cleveland, then Pittsburgh, then the rest of the tour stretching into December. The machine couldn't stop for one person's identity crisis. Ace finished removing his makeup that night, his hands shaking slightly as he wiped away the last traces of silver. He looked at his bare face one more time, at the red eyes from crying, at the skin irritated from the harsh removal process. Then he dried his tears, stood up, and walked out of that dressing room like nothing had happened. Gene and Paul never mentioned it again. To them, it was an isolated incident, a moment of tour fatigue that would resolve itself with rest. They went back to their hotel room alone. Ace went to his, opened the minibar, and drank until he couldn't think anymore. Vodka first, then whatever else was available. He drank until the face in the mirror stopped mattering, until Paul Frehley and Space Ace both disappeared into a comfortable numbness. It was the first time he'd used alcohol specifically to erase himself, but it wouldn't be the last. That night in Detroit became a turning point, though nobody realized it at the time. A habit that would become a pattern, then a problem. Then a crisis of its own that would nearly destroy him years later. But in that moment, alcohol was the only thing that made the emptiness bearable, the only chemical escape from a reality that had become unbearable. The only thing that made Paul Frehley feel like something instead of nothing, that filled the hollow space where his identity used to be. Over the next few years, the drinking got worse, more frequent, more desperate. The drug use started shortly after, cocaine primarily, anything that could alter his consciousness enough to forget the face he couldn't recognize anymore. Ace would later admit in interviews, decades after getting sober, that his substance abuse issues began in earnest during the late 70s, during the height of Kiss's success. During those years when the world loved Space Ace more than he'd ever been loved as a regular person, and couldn't have cared less about Paul Frehley, the human being. The substances became his way of existing between the two identities, of numbing the transition from character to person and back again. They made the makeup application bearable and the removal process survivable. For a while, they worked. Until they stopped working and became their own nightmare, their own kind of identity erasure. The character never went away. Kiss kept the makeup until 1983, when they finally took it off for the Lick It Up album. By then, Ace had already left the band, unable to reconcile who he was with what he was expected to be. His departure in 1982 was officially about creative differences, about wanting to pursue solo projects. But people close to him knew the truth. He left because he needed to find himself again, needed to exist as a human being instead of a marketable character. It took him years of struggle, of addiction, of hitting bottom and clawing back up. But eventually, Paul Frehley re-emerged, not as Space Ace, not as some cosmic character, just as a guy from the Bronx who happened to be an incredible guitar player. The reunion tour in 1996 was bittersweet. Ace put the makeup back on, stepped back into the Space Ace persona for fans who'd never stopped loving the character. But this time, it was different. He knew the difference between the person and the persona. He could put on the silver face and take it off without losing himself. The makeup was a costume, not an identity. Today, Ace Frehley is in his 70s. He still plays guitar, still tours occasionally, still signs autographs for fans who bring their childhood Space Ace action figures. And when people ask him about the makeup years, about the character that defined a generation, he talks about it with a mix of pride and caution. Pride, because Space Ace gave joy to millions of people, because that character helped build something truly special. But caution, because he remembers what it cost. He remembers the night in Detroit when he looked in the mirror and couldn't find himself. He remembers the years it took to come back from that. The lesson Ace learned, the one he sometimes shares with young musicians who approach him for advice, is simple but profound. Never let the character become more real than the person. Never let the image erase the identity. Because makeup washes off. But the soul underneath has to last a lifetime. And if you lose track of who you are beneath the costume, you might spend years trying to find your way back. Space Ace was magnificent. He was cosmic, larger than life, unforgettable. But Paul Frehley survived. And in the end, survival matters more than spectacle.